Hello again, everyone. Tom Degorski in the Cipher Brief virtual studio, here for a conversation today about innovation and change in the U.S. military, perhaps the need for more of it, as our guests will get into in a moment. They are the co-authors of an essay, an article that appeared recently in the New York Times under the heading Reimagining the American War Machine. When I say they, I'm referring to our guests, Kelly Grieco, Senior Fellow with, and this is a great title for the program, given what we're talking about. She is with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. And also with us, delighted to have Colonel Max Bremer, Chief of the Advanced Program Division at the U.S. Air Mobility Command. Colonel Bremer would like it known that the views he expresses here are not necessarily the military's. Kelly, let me start with you because you get into some interesting advice or suggested solutions for the issues you talk about in the piece. But let's maybe talk about the problem first. What do you think needs fixing, and what drove you to write the piece?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having us. Well, what I would say is when we're thinking about innovation and the future of warfare, the DoD has a real challenge, which is trying to, in some ways, predict what it will look like in the future, the character of war. And militaries, are averse to risk. It makes sense. This is a serious business trying to predict the future. And so they try to manage that uncertainty. And the tendency is in managing uncertainty, is to look at what's worked in the past and say, well, that's worked in the past, so we should do that again in the future. That works when warfare is not changing very rapidly and technology is not changing very rapidly. The problem, though, is that today, when technologies are rapidly changing and we're seeing tremendous changes on the battlefield, it's actually creating risk that's not appreciated.
Max, you've seen this, I assume, from the inside. What's your perspective on exactly the issues Kelly just raised?
But Tom, thanks for having us because this is important. My perspective is that if we look at history, it's not really a linear or straightforward thing. And the original title, when Kelly and I started working on this, we wanted to say that we need to start placing new and more aggressive bets because the military is a very risk-averse organization, and justifiably so. When the military fails, the nation fails. And so there has to be a certain amount of risk aversion. But there's a big difference between acute risk aversion and chronic risk aversion. And when we try to manage both and be risk averse in both areas, we run into problems. It is much easier, especially within the acquisition process, to make small changes to weapon systems, to incrementally increase their capability, because we know that they've worked in the past. And so we can bet on them working in the future just a little bit better. But when there are major changes technologically, when you move from an agrarian society to an industrial society or an industrial society to an information society, those changes are continued over into the technologies of the day. And it's okay if industrial age sort of grows on slowly and not much changes. But when you change from an industrial age to an information age, fundamentally the way warfare is fought will change. And the military has to change with that, which means we have to bet on a changing future, not a static future.
So disabuse me then of an assumption that I have. You've both painted this in sort of broad brush strokes. I've heard a lot about this issue. I think you make the point in the piece, it's not new. One also hears and knows that there are rather large enterprises within the Pentagon and the defense industrial system that do nothing but work on innovation. And so are there examples of what you're talking about? Maybe I'll start with you, Kelly, where whatever they're doing hasn't been enough?
Yes. I mean, you make a good point, which is this has been recognized for a while as a problem. And there have been, good efforts to try to address this in ways with different innovation cells, the replicator initiative. The issue, though, is that if you actually look at the percentage of the budget that these programs represent, it is really small. And even many of these programs are a little less, I would say, than meets the eye sometimes, right? Like the Replicator Initiative, was getting, tens of thousands of new drones, whereas, in Ukraine, where they're using millions a year. So the scale is not quite there, I think, is one of the real issues. And still, the majority of money is being spent on these smaller numbers of expensive, exquisite systems, the B-21, submarines, carriers, which we may still need. But we probably need a course correction in terms of how much we're spending on those programs versus these new innovative technologies that give us more options.
You want to add to that, Max?
Yeah, I'd like to. This is where I think Kelly and I continue the conversation together, because I don't really think that innovation comes from the military. As a risk averse, the incentives are just not there. And I work with some awesome folks at AFWorks and DIU that are really into innovation. But when you look, innovation is taking something that currently exists and using it in a very different way. And that is going to come from industry. That is our comparative advantage over directed economies, is we can have a lot of industrial efforts that fail, and that's okay. Companies can fail, but the military can't. So innovation, by definition, is going to come from the civilian sector. Our job in the military should be to present them with the problems. Here's what we can't do, or here's where we see challenges in the future. And so while we do have a lot of innovation efforts going on, the structural incentives to create things that are going to fail a lot are just not there. In the military, we don't like failure.
Recognizing excellence in national security. The Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
I want to ask you actually about one specific case you did bring up of an innovation that I guess has just gone painfully slowly, and that was something, if I'm not mistaken, called the quad squads, which were these quadcopter drones for individual units. Kelly, what was the story there? Because this, I think, was kicked around almost a decade ago. Is that right?
It was. This is the Marine Corps Commandant at the time announced that the goal was to have every Marine squad have a quadcopter. And that still hasn't happened. I actually, for this article, I reached out even to some Marines that I know that are commanding infantry to ask if this had happened. And they said they still, some of them have the quadcopters, but not all of them. And there are two problems, I think. There are two reasons for this, really. One is that we don't actually have in the United States our own domestic drone industry that can support this kind of effort. Most of the drones, about 80 to 90% of them today, are actually produced by China. The company DJI dominates the market in these smaller quadcopters. And there are some US firms that make them. They're much more expensive. And the volume that they produce is, 5,000-6,000 a month. So it's very small. That's the first problem. And then I'd say the second one is just a hesitancy on the part of the military to embrace these technologies and to allow the rank and file to actually be able to test them and play with them and come up with innovative concepts. Because it's not enough just to have the technology. It has to be paired with doctrine and tactics. And again, I think this is another area where we see risk in terms of just putting these in the hands of the rank and file, as opposed to saying, let's do that and see what kind of great ideas and what we learn from doing that.
All right. So this takes us, and these countries couldn't be more different in every way. But I want to spend a moment on China and a moment on Ukraine, because when you talk about drones, they both get their way into the conversation. And Max, we'll come to you on China. You wrote in the piece that not just with drones, I take it, that they're acquiring weapons at a rate 5 times that of the United States. When you talk about, here again, you need to disabuse me of probably an old notion that the United States, if it had any great calling card, it's innovation, right? And maybe it's your point, Max, that that's more in the private sector than the public domain. But how is it, or is it that in this area, at least, the Chinese seem to be out innovating us as well? Is that right?
Well, part of it is a first mover advantage. They started building drones. They have, I think at the end of 2023, 1.2 to 1.4 million registered civilian drones in the country. And so they're actually letting the civilian and the commercial sector use them, which then generates a demand signal so they can produce more of them. And they, of course, are selling them all over the world. So when you are producing that much, you can afford to sort of innovate slowly. You can make incremental changes. And the DJI Mavic to the DJI Mavic 2 and the Mavic 3 were very small changes, but we haven't had the chance to make even those kind of changes in the U.S. Drone industry, whether it's small UASs or large ones. So China has an advantage in that they are already producing way more than we are capable of producing, which gives them the option of trying a lot of different things. They're spreading the risk out greatly.
So,
And I think it's worth adding that part of this is a strategy choice on the part of the Chinese as well. So, for example, DJI, the drone company I mentioned earlier, there was some reporting by the Washington Post a couple of years ago that showed that they received tremendous government funding, that company, to help support them early on. So there is that civil military fusion that people talk about. It is true in terms of some of these technologies as well, that the Chinese in Beijing, they've decided that this is an area where they want their country to lead, and they're aggressively pursuing it.
And they're not stopping with just small things like that. I think the white whale, their new cargo UAS, is a great example of them continuing to scale up and understanding that in order to start using a technology, you have to not only see how it works, but gain trust in it. And the way you gain trust in an unmanned or an autonomous capability is by using it and letting people see that it's not as scary as their imaginations let them run with. And the easiest way to do that is not create something that's intentionally designed to destroy things. So the use of hobby drones to take pictures or to scan farmland, they've turned that into a surveillance capability and a weapons capability. They're doing the same thing with larger things where we tend to start with, how do I make this into a weapon or a weapons carrier? They're starting with, how do I make this into a cargo carrier that I can sell to China companies or companies across Africa, eventually Europe, Middle East. And so we're seeing the growth of that industry, which is, to me, a lot scarier than looking at how they are weaponizing them.
Right. Now, okay, let's go to Ukraine. Old saw cliche that necessity is the mother of invention. So, of course, another way to really ramp up your innovation, unfortunately, is to have Russian forces pouring into your country. And we have talked a lot at the Cipher Brief about really the remarkable innovation, speed, scale, and so forth that have come with Ukraine and its domestic industry. What is it true now that the United States defense sector is really studying and learning from the Ukrainian experience? And what are some examples of that? Kelly, you first.
Yes. So, you're correct about this. I mean, the Ukrainians have been incredibly innovative in terms of using commercial technologies in particular, whether it's drones or it's jammers, to try to gain an advantage. And I think they've done a number of things that we can learn from them. So, for example, one is that they have this really rapid adaptation cycle, in part because they have engineers close to the battlefront to actually interact with people in the field to figure out what kind of adjustments need to be made. And that really is allowing them to have this fast cycle. And then I would also say, yes, you're right. This has been, for U.S. Defense companies, European defense companies are able to send their prototypes to Ukraine and gain data about how effective they are, to learn about how they do in an environment with a lot of electronic warfare, things like that. And so there are a lot of incentives for these companies to be able to go to Ukraine to try out their product to see how it does. And we're gaining a lot of information of these companies and also the U.S. military as well.
You want to add to that, Max?
I think it's important to also look at what we're not learning or what are the wrong lessons that we might be learning. The first thing that when I look at Ukraine, this is not the first war that this was an issue. Armenia, Azerbaijan was where this really started as something's different. And you're right, necessity is the mother of invention. But the necessity wasn't we need a lot of small drones. The necessity was we need a way to attack through the air when effectively large aircraft are denied, when surface-to-air missile systems have ranges that are incredible and radars are integrated well. How do we get through that? And there's two ways to do that. You can double down on being quieter and more stealthy, or you can just throw so much at the problem that you can overcome it. And we've been through this before. The Army had to figure out, do we want to go with a single shot breech loader, or do we want to go with a repeating rifle? So it's not just an Air Force thing. When you look at the way the M1 Garand was built with only 8 shots, the idea was we don't want soldiers just shooting a lot. There's a place for that. There's a place for precision, for snipers on the battlefield, but there's also a place for SAWs, for SWAT automatic weapons that are laying down suppressive fire. And no matter how good your sniper rifle is, we can still only shoot one shot at a time at a very specific target. And I think that the lesson that Ukraine figured out is we need enough stuff that's up there that complicates the air battle space so that Russia can no longer fight the way it thought it needed to fight. And I don't know that we've internalized that lesson. We are learning the lessons about EW is hard, and you have to evolve very rapidly. We're learning lessons that production is hard. Now Ukraine is producing 2 million drones a year. That's an astounding number for a country that is under constant attack. But have we learned that lesson? How did they get to that point? Did they have their manufacturing base ready to go, and do we?
And
So now you go ahead.
I was going to pick up on something Max said, because I think it's important then to ask, well, why are we not learning the kind of lessons Max is talking about or resistant to those? And I think it's partly because the American bias is to focus on particular systems. We saw this even in the debate about Ukraine, right? Like about whether we should send HIMARS or ATACMS or F-16s. We focus on very specific platforms. And you kind of see a little bit of that as well in the debate about what are we learning from Ukraine. So people are very fixated, for example, on, well, small drones should be one of the lessons. Well, small drones may be relevant in certain, theaters, right? Like Europe, for example. But in the Indo-Pacific, they may be less relevant, like the kind of commercial quadcopters we're seeing in Ukraine, because you're going to need things with longer range. The broader lesson, though, is more about what Max is talking about, which is more about how do you contest airspace, how the need for mass, the need to be able to adapt quickly to an EW environment. So moving away from the fixation on particular platforms to the broader lessons about the challenges the battlefield is posing and the kinds of solutions that we need to work towards developing.
I'm glad you mentioned solutions, because we need, before we wrap, to get to some of those. And here, again, from a distance, disruption certainly seems to be a hallmark of the new administration. We have heard a lot of talk vis-a-vis the Pentagon about the need for all kinds of change there. What change do you think is needed to deal with some of the problems? I want to ask that one first, and then we can come to what you think is going on right now with the leadership. Max, why don't you start?
Sure. So first, we need to acknowledge that we have a problem. One of the biggest challenges when dealing with any bureaucratic process is getting to the point to say we actually have to have a problem and do things differently. Typically, militaries only make radical change after a defeat. It's not after a success. And, we've had 30 years of one type of combat in the Middle East, and we learned a lot from that. But I don't think we look at that as a failure that causes us to need to change radically. So the first thing is to acknowledge the need for a change. And the second is then look at can I imagine what the future will look like of combat? I can't do analysis on the future. I can't do a regression and say this is exactly what it's going to look like. Because as soon as we start to change something, adversaries will also change. And so we need to change our processes to be adaptive in real time to what's going on in other areas, both economically and in other military areas, so that we can create challenges for our adversaries instead of just trying to close our own challenges.
Kelly, over to you. What needs?
Yeah. Sorry, say it again. So go ahead.
What needs fixing?
There are lots of good ideas out there, about how to fix procurement and make processes faster and more flexible. And those are all really good ideas. But I would say the more fundamental issue that Pentagon needs to tackle is how it thinks about risk. It thinks about risk in terms of trying to eliminate it, minimize it, but doesn't seem to recognize risk is going to be there. And we're actually creating risks for ourselves by doing the same thing the same way and hoping that it will work again. And I think we need to acknowledge we are facing adversaries that are adaptive and creative. And American ingenuity has always been one of our core strengths. And so really thinking about how we can marshal these new technologies to our advantage, not seeing them as much as disrupting our preferred way of doing war so that we can go back to fighting the way we like, but how can we actually marshal these and make them to our advantage to create a really challenging problem set so that whether it's Russia or China doesn't actually want to start a war because they're likely to lose.
Yeah. I'd like to, a more specific thing. We've talked about risk. We've talked about how to think about the future. But our procurement system is designed to minimize procurement risk. And that's because when you're buying a platform that's going to fly for the next 50 years, you have to do that. You can't fail at that. But when you're buying platforms that are designed to fly for the next year and then they're obsolete, you can't afford to spend 5 years de-risking that procurement process. And so as we pivot away from procuring platforms to procuring systems and then procuring capabilities, we have to look at what things do we treat like a disposable item, even if it's not a weapon, and what things do we treat like a long-term capital investment. I think the capital investments are in multiple companies, some of which can fail and should because they screw up, but others should reap the rewards of the risks that they took. And our procurement system, as well as our requirement system, needs to acknowledge that we don't know what the future looks like. So we need to take a lot of bets on a lot of different things and stuff that's not going to be around or useful in 5 years. Instead of throwing away and saying we're not going to buy it at all, we say, how do we buy that for a year and then turn it to the hands of the warfighters to use it and see how well it works while we're buying the next great thing that they will then be able to use. And then we have to do that at scale.
I think we're going to need to leave it there, but it's a great conversation, probably just the beginning of a conversation. I'm reminded of something else you said in your piece that started us here about the Ukrainians prizing, I think you said, agility over certainty, and it goes to the points you both made. Thank you both, Kelly Grieco and Colonel Max Bremer. Great to have you with us at the Cipher Brief. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.